Welcome to the Indigenous Navigators Survey Module on Climate Change and Indigenous Peoples' Rights. In this video tutorial, we give you an introduction to the reason why this module was developed, the purpose of this module, what it covers, and offer some examples of how the data you generate can be used. Why is this module on climate change and Indigenous peoples needed? Globally, Indigenous peoples face some of the most direct consequences of climate change due to their unique relationship with the environment and its natural resources. It's important that the impacts of climate change on Indigenous peoples are documented. This includes documenting the impacts of climate change that may cause harm to Indigenous peoples' rights. For example, rising sea temperatures impacting fish stocks on which a community depends. This may impact the community's right to food. And the impacts of climate change related projects, measures, policies and plans which may violate Indigenous peoples' rights. For example, carbon credit projects or similar, which might use areas of Indigenous land in a way that does not align with the rights of Indigenous peoples to land. This may be a violation of these rights by the state or a private business. The impacts of climate change are also compounded by experiences of colonization and systemic discrimination, resulting in persistent violations of Indigenous rights, often relating to Indigenous peoples' rights to lands and territories and to their cultural traditions and practices. The data collected by the Indigenous Navigators Main Survey allows for a comprehensive assessment by Indigenous peoples of the implementation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or UNDRIP. However, it does not link gaps in implementation to states' actions or omission in the context of climate change, or to specific commitments and targets within key climate change and environmental agreements. This new climate change module aims to address these gaps. Furthermore, the continued engagement of Indigenous peoples with the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or UNFCCC, including through direct participation at the Global Climate Summit COP, and through the Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples platform, has led to a call for more community-based monitoring tools that capture the impacts of climate change and adaptation in Indigenous communities. There is currently an absence of locally generated and organised data by Indigenous peoples themselves on the extent of the rights violations they face in the context of climate change, and on their important contributions as custodians of lands, forests, and natural resources to the protection and sustainable management of resources. What is the purpose of the Climate Change and Indigenous Peoples module? The purpose of the new module is to monitor if a state lives up to its human rights obligations towards Indigenous peoples in the context of climate change, to document the impacts of climate change on the human rights of Indigenous peoples or human rights harms, and to document the impacts of climate change related projects, measures, policies and plans on Indigenous peoples or human rights violations. How is the module structured? The Climate Change Survey module is made up of two surveys. Both surveys support Indigenous peoples to assess the impacts of climate change and climate change measures on their rights. The National Survey is a tool for assessing the gaps in climate change related policies, laws and implementation frameworks from an Indigenous peoples and human rights perspective. The Community Assessment helps document the lived experiences of Indigenous peoples in terms of the human rights harms and violations of climate change and climate change related measures. Both surveys consist of 9 domains. These domains follow the thematic categorization of UNDRIP decided upon by Indigenous peoples after a series of consultations when developing the main surveys. However, the climate change surveys only include those domains where the impact of climate change and climate change related measures has proved to be most significant. Questions in the surveys are therefore organised under the following domains: self-determination, cultural integrity, lands, territories and resources, fundamental rights and freedoms, participation in public life, legal protection, access to justice and remedy, general economic and social development, health, and employment and occupation. How was the Climate Change and Indigenous Rights module developed? The climate change surveys have been developed in close cooperation with Indigenous peoples organisations. The surveys follow the methodology of the Indigenous Navigator. It is therefore based on the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights Indicator methodology, and is anchored in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and its underlying binding human rights standards and obligations. The climate change surveys, however, also link these human rights obligations to specific climate and environmental standards, showing how Indigenous rights and human rights should inform the implementation of these frameworks. The specific international and national climate change standards and frameworks will be introduced in another video. How can the data collected from these assessments be used? The following are some examples of how the data can be used. To create greater awareness within Indigenous communities of their rights and the impact of climate change and climate change-related measures on these rights. To inform and strengthen Indigenous peoples' own development projects and programs in the context of climate change. To support Indigenous peoples' advocacy on climate change-related laws, policies, and implementation frameworks at national levels. And to feed into human rights and climate change-related reporting frameworks, for example, reports to the Universal Periodic Review process, advocating at COPs, or participating in global, regional, or national climate action planning. A note on safely collecting data. Like the General Indigenous Navigator survey, these surveys include questions on sensitive issues. This includes asking questions about killings, harassment, threats, or harm to Indigenous peoples. This means that it is important to consider the safety of participants and relevant Indigenous communities when planning how to collect and store the data. It is key that surveys are only carried out in the communities once the communities have provided their free, prior, and informed consent and have clearly been informed of and agreed to how the data will be used. When carrying out the surveys, measures need to be taken to ensure that participants feel and are safe to answer. As such, different data collection methodologies can be adopted to ensure the safety and security of individuals and communities. For example, it might be necessary to have a private conversation or hold conversations in smaller groups where members know and trust each other. No data that can identify a particular individual through the inclusion of personal identifiers should ever be put in the comment or reference box in the surveys or in any other way stored. Only numbers and aggregated data should be included in the survey responses with a description of the methodology used to collect the data indicated in the reference box.